Ken Biberaj, and welcome to Coffee with Ken, a thought leadership series at the nexus of business and politics. In the news today, the chairman of the Federal Reserve announced that more interest rate hikes are likely in the future to keep inflation reducing. And the Prime Minister of India is in Washington today to meet with the president for a state visit. Today's topic is the future of AI, and we are joined by a pretty dynamic and awesome panel. Sue Hendrickson, the executive director of the Berkman Center at Harvard, Leigh Marie Braswell, partner at Kleiner Perkins, and Markie Wagner, the founder of Delphi Labs. Great to see you. Thanks for being here, guys.
Hey, Ken.
Pleasure.
I know they're on the West Coast, and I apologize. Thank you for doing this so early, but hopefully you have a lot of coffee. So it was funny. We were joking before we went live, like just the amount of research, just like in the 5-6 weeks from when we first planned this. And I feel like sometimes we get lucky with the timing of these conversations. And I mean, when we were planning this, I think like late spring and kind of anticipation of this, so much has happened just in this like 5-6 weeks. And yesterday, the president of the United States was in San Francisco meeting with tech leaders to talk about AI. Chuck Schumer has a big speech today talking about what the Senate's going to do to, focus on artificial intelligence. So maybe we kind of just like have a quick introductory moment where we go around and each of you can kind of say just a couple sentences about, what you're doing today and like how you fit in the AI space, and maybe just like, any kind of quick high level thoughts before we dive into the nitty gritty. And Sue, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure. So I'm Sue Hendrickson. Thanks, Ken, for having us here for this. Really looking forward to the discussion. I'm at the Berkman Center at Harvard, which is an Internet and Society Center, an interfaculty initiative that works to provide evidence-based research, dialogues, and convenings around important issues related to how our digital world is affecting society. And so in that space, prior to that, I was a deal lawyer in Washington for 3 decades, working on emerging technology. And so my background with respect to AI is both as a deal lawyer working on some major transactions in the AI space, as well as now being a commenter, thinking about an expert, thinking about the societal implications of where we're heading with AI and the governance solutions for that.
Amazing. Leigh Marie.
Hi, everybody. I'm Leigh Marie, partner at Kleiner Perkins, mostly focused on early stage ML and DevTools investments. Prior to Kleiner, I was at Founders Fund, another VC firm, for a few years. And prior to that, I was one of the first engineers at a machine learning startup called Scale AI, and then a product manager there. So kind of my background as it relates to AI, sort of worked at one of the leading AI infrastructure companies, and then now have made multiple investments both on the application and infrastructure side. So generally, spend most of my time looking at and working with companies in the space.
Amazing. Markie?
Thanks for having us, Ken. I run Delphi Labs, which is a research and advisory firm where we work with founders anywhere from day zero to folks who've gone public as they build and go to market with AI teams and products for the first time. So, and then before that was a researcher at Waymo and Stanford and Google, and been focused on AI for a very long time now.
Nice. Well, Markie, let's stay on you for a second, right? Like, explain to me like where we are in the history or era of AI, right? Like AI is around, right? Like, whether you're doing searches on Amazon or Google, et cetera, like it's kind of informing and, impacting our lives day to day. But where are we in terms of like what era, what stage, like how early are we in what will end up being a big part of all our lives?
Yeah, I mean, looking back on AI, the idea and kind of concept of this machines that can learn and think was happened at the same time that the concept of the computer came online. And so there are so many generations, so many eras before us who have toiled on this idea of what AI or machine learning could be, but never really got to see what that looked like. And the generations before us, and the particular moment that we're in, there was this predictive AI era, which was kind of characterized by these recommender systems, and you have all these features, and you'd predict some kind of label, and that was the era that we were in for the past, I don't know, call it like N years before this. And we're now sort of entering this generative, I guess we're calling it generative AI era, which is characterized by having access to these really large language models at the call of an API, whereas before you need a whole lot of training data to make an AI model useful. You need all these labels and you need all of these features that were clean and ideally right? To build something useful. But today you can build something useful day one just by calling an API, and kind of make it more and more useful as you build product around it, give it better examples, etc. And so that's where I would really think about this inflection point. And with that kind of level of machine intelligence coming online for fractions of pennies on the dollar, we're seeing a lot of new things that just became possible.
Interesting. And Sue, you guys just had a piece come out kind of on generative AI and the future of teaching and learning. I mean, talk about like that piece in general and kind of how you're thinking about what kind of, policy research you want to kind of put out there to have in front of everybody as this is moving so quickly.
Sure. And maybe just kind of speaking, I mean, I tend to think of us as in the kind of peak of a hype cycle right now around AI issues. And what happened, I love the way that you described that, Markie. And then I feel like what happened with the launch of kind of ChatGPT is all of a sudden it became accessible to a wide AI, which had been this concept that had been in the background where machine learning experts and others were playing with it. We were all using it maybe in Spotify or maybe in, our mapping software. It was all there beforehand, but it hadn't hit the kind of public conscience that you could bring this in, and there weren't ways that it was user friendly. And there's also a new, what people call anthropomorphizing of it, like making it seem like it's a human, which I think is, troubling in a sense, because it really is statistical modeling. And so the kinds of things, we had looked at this right when ChatGPT came out with OpenAI and Khan Academy to look at both some of the ways that this might affect teaching and learning and pedagogy, and thinking about ways that you could bring this together, as well as thinking about kind of where the policy interventions are around that. And so, I've been thinking about it both in the space of it being a disruptive technology, but also one that we need to think about governing. And I know we can get to that kind of later, but that, kind of good governance really is essential to this, and trying to think about how that governance challenge spreads across society and across the globe with respect to all of the actors involved in this ecosystem, in order to kind of bring this technology into something that is going to be really fostering of kind of human flourishing and where we want to go with these new capabilities.
And Leigh Marie, is it a hype cycle? I mean, what are you seeing from the deal flow? I mean, there seems to be obviously a ton of interest and focus on this, right? Like, what are you seeing? I mean, is this a bubble? Are we early? Is it, where are we on this?
Totally. I mean, in terms of what I'm seeing, there's an overwhelming sort of flurry of activity in the space. I mean, not only do you have incumbents integrating like the technology into their products, which is super exciting, but we also have just so many new early stage companies getting formed. And so probably, the majority of my meetings are new or very sort of early stage companies that have just started in the space. In terms of whether or not it's a hype cycle, it kind of depends on how you define hype cycle. I think what is quite different here is it's just very clear some of the benefits of this technology, whether it's a lot of companies we've seen increase their revenue by like a substantial portion, even if they're older companies, by being able to offer some sort of co-pilot service where, you can, for example, if I'm a note-taking app, I can go in and have something like a ChatGPT experience when it comes to brainstorming. A lot of consumers will pay extra for having that sort of experience, or it just increases the efficiency of you using certain tools, and can ultimately help companies with their bottom line. So it's, and it's very early in the rollout of all of this. Like only sort of the most tech forward companies have really integrated it deeply into their products. And I do strongly believe that every vertical will be touched by this technology. And so either an incumbent's going to figure out a way to utilize it, or there'll be an opportunity for a startup to come in and potentially disrupt the space by creating an AI first product. So, there is a lot of hype, but then at the same time, I think there is a lot of substance, as we've already started to really see with just companies increasing their revenue and decreasing cost.
Good.
I was gonna say it takes a long time to create value. I mean, we're looking around and, Leigh Marie and I were just talking about this, where, if we believe that there's going to be a couple institutions that come out of this particular moment in history, right? Who's going to be the Amazon and who's going to be the Google that just discovers $100 billion market. Like, what is that going to look like? Even if you have a sense of what that is, it'll still take many, many, many decades to go and do the hard work of building something really great for the people that make up that market or set of people that would want to buy that thing. And so, it is unsurprising to me that the really interesting AI companies that aren't just this, people call it wrapper, but this, really obvious, like small implementation of the technology have not yet been built. Particularly because I think even more than ChatGPT, what's enabling this particular moment of history is this GPT-4, right? It's this discontinuous jump in the capabilities of these language models. And so the stuff that I'm interested in, really excited about, are these kind of second and third order consequences, kind of interesting companies that are building, harnessing around that model to make sure that it's right a lot and can do things that are helpful and useful and sanity check it, et cetera. And I would imagine that it would take quite a while to build a lot of that stuff and make it useful. And so we've seen some canaries in the coal mine, right? If the question's like, can AI create a lot of value that is durable and meaningful? And I think, Leigh Marie's been talking about this longer than anyone I've ever known. But Copilot and code generation is an example where the answer is yes. We see it in the numbers. Copilot's really useful and durable and sticky, and lots of people feel like they can't live without it. And so I think that's a canary in the coal mine, but there'll be lots of things like that that just take longer to build. And so what that means in terms of hype cycle, I don't know. I think that there are a lot of people who care a lot about making this stuff useful to humanity, because the story of, I think, where we are is similar to where maybe computers were in the early days, where we have a terminal, which is awesome. And you might say, we need a terminal on every desk. Everyone needs to be chatting with ChatGPT all the time. But realistically, we're like a few jumps away from putting this stuff into the hands of humanity in its most useful forms. Maybe it means our version of the GUI and the mouse, or maybe that means something else. But that stuff just takes a really long time to build.
Well, I think that's a good segue to you, Sue. I mean, you had a big opinion piece in The Hill last week, kind of on this topic of AI doesn't need to be inhumane. I mean, what was your thread there?
Right. I mean, because that's the thing. I mean, picking up on, what you were saying too. I mean, I feel like I love innovation and what's happening with respect to it, and think this technology has so much capability for innovation. But I also see this as this kind of blend. I think somebody, I forget who it was, described it as a blend between a gold rush and an atomic crisis. And like, where are we in that? Because you have these, world leaders who are out there who are the tech company leaders who are all saying this is a moment of crisis with respect to the dangers of the technology. You have the innovation potential, like I think in particular in the life sciences, that this technology will really be transformative. But I agree with you, down many of the verticals, and perhaps all of them in our society, it's going to touch it. But I do worry that we need guardrails and governance around this, and that there are externalities associated with it that we as a society and we as a globe need to confront, in that with structures where the governance can really, in the same way that with pharmaceutical products or something, we have regulatory regimes and other governance structures that help us make sure that those products are safe and trustworthy. I feel that we need that in the AI space as well, and to think about what that means across these different verticals. So in that article that we did for The Hill, what Dr. Raman Chowdhury and she used to be the head of machine learning ethics and transparency at Twitter, has a longtime participant in the responsible AI community and a fellow with me at Berkman Klein. And what we were advocating with respect to that is that we really do need to think about how we are designing this and how we are designing the governance structures in order to foster human flourishing, because there are things, whether it's the workers that are involved in it, whether it's the bias issues associated with how the data sets have been constructed with respect to this, or whether it's the possibility for malign uses of the technology, that we need to figure out how we're going to wrestle with those things, and both at a national level and at a global level and across the ecosystem, figure out how we're going to design for that.
So just a broad question to all of you. I mean, is every company going to have kind of like an AI director to kind of help enable their companies in the future to leverage AI, and at the same time having a kind of AI risk kind of mitigator to kind of oversee and self-govern each company? I mean, how is this going to work, you think? I mean, or how should it work? Should people just be focused on the innovation and the growth, or do they need to also self-check along the way? I mean, because I know some banks are having responsible AI people that they're hiring, and that kind of thing. I mean, maybe Leigh Marie, if you have any thoughts on that.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, I think the first part of the question is, will every company have an AI director? not sure exactly how that's going to look. I think it really depends on the exact company. We're starting to see different strategies that companies are taking. I think these more sort of like historically tech focused businesses, that makes a lot of sense. And they really sort of have the opportunity to weigh the different approaches, whether it's using the APIs or from a foundation model provider or training something internally. Like one example that was really cool to see here was Bloomberg and seeing how they trained a financial foundation model on a lot of their internal data, which is obviously a huge proprietary advantage. And a model that can perform really well on specific tasks that they needed to. But not every company is going to be able to do that. And so, I imagine there'll be a lot of acquisition activity in the space. We haven't seen a ton yet, but it's something that I would not be surprised if in the next year or two we see a giant acquisition of a company like for its LLM capabilities in particular, powering like an incumbent solution. And so then maybe, and then I think also there's kind of the strategy of, like I work with an OpenAI and a Bain and, like I have sort of, it's like a consulting engagement. So, I think there'll be a few different flavors of this. And I think it just kind of depends on the DNA of the company and what exactly how much they want to lean in to becoming an AI first company, with the risk that if they don't lean in enough, like I do think that there are a ton of awesome opportunities for startups to come and challenge incumbents. So that's probably like what I see on the AI director side. In terms of the AI risk side, yeah, a lot less sure about that. I agree with you that people or companies where there's a large risk that, them using AI could lead to some just definitely harmful bias. Like if a bank uses AI, I mean, they could sort of discriminate or, if the training data set isn't done correctly, as Sue was talking about, that could be very harmful to their end user. So I think it's a good strategy for them to have people sort of in charge of that alongside people focused more on the innovation.
Sue?
I was going to say, I think it's a really complicated issue, as you say, because as a society, I mean, every company, particularly startups, aren't going to be able to afford all of those people at the same time as it's critical. And we see at the large tech companies, even there have been layoffs of those trust and safety teams and others who this was some of their core responsibility. So I'll say kind of two things with respect to this. So one, today there's a big launch for a task force that I was lucky to be a participant in, that's been run by the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab. It's called the Task Force for a Trustworthy Web. And what that's really looked at is many, many different dimensions of this kind of trust and safety issue, and how we think about that in companies going forward and as a society in terms of doing that, including with respect to the implications for generative AI tools there. And I think there's a lot of really good recommendations in that task force for how we might think about this across society. And then the other thing that I'd say is that, and it shows that there are a lot of gaps right now in terms of how we're thinking about this. Just the bottom line, there's much work for us to do, and there's roles to fill in. But I also was happy to see, I mean, I believe that the governance is something where governance is the responsibility of governments, of the companies, of investors, of everyone. And I was happy to see a recent article in the Financial Times where asset managers are kind of pressuring tech companies to think about this from your own, because the companies aren't necessarily going to have the capabilities to do it, particularly in the startup realm. And I do think that if in that situation, it was the Collective Impact Coalition for Digital Inclusion, which is 32 financial institutions representing, I think it's 6.9 trillion in assets under management. And there you have a kind of strong voice that is able to say, influence these businesses towards ethical AI and make sure that what you're doing is there. And we also need to figure out what the skills are. I don't think we quite know yet. It's still nascent in terms of what the real ask is for companies in terms of ethical AI. We know we want it to be something where there's issues related to the, thinking about the human rights implications, thinking about the bias implications, thinking about the ways that these affect kind of data privacy and others. But I think that whole field is just developing right now. And, we're looking at that on both the global, and national, and full ecosystem level.
Wow, it's amazing. And Markie, I mean, I feel in some of our previous conversations, I mean, you're dealing with different level of folks at organizations now who are kind of like really paying attention to this, right? It's not just CTOs, it's CEOs, CFOs, COOs, right? Like how is that kind of learning curve? How are you seeing that in live time? How are you seeing like a market of opportunity for, other players to kind of enter and add value and maybe companies as co-pilots to other companies to help them kind of accelerate their onboarding and understanding and, effectiveness on AI?
Yeah, and it's been something to watch the relationship with this persona of someone who's not in the Valley, who might be running a company in the middle of America or something in sports or media or entertainment or whatever that is. Their relationship with AI changed from, I've been promised so much about AI. Our data is not in the right place. I don't know if we can make this work or even make AI useful in our company, to having this magic moment playing with ChatGPT last fall and saying, oh my goodness, whatever I thought was true about AI, I no longer know if that's true or not. And I just saw magic. And so how do I go and make this useful in my company? I know I don't want to miss the boat. And I think a lot of mid-markets and honestly, even Fortune 500 companies feel like they were a bit left behind by different trends in software. They're like, I'm still running an ERP from 20 years ago. And I'm still using XYZ systems that, would get me laughed at if I was in Silicon Valley. And they don't want to feel that way this time. I think that there's a lot of optimism that maybe that there is some kind of great equalizer here, or maybe that this stuff is going to be so flexible that it helps them, even though they're not on the newest software. And so that's been quite interesting. I think a lot of them realize that it'll be hard to bring in some kind of AI director. Sometimes it's what we get pinged to be that person in the room who helps. And sometimes they want to go build something in-house and they want to say, oh, we can afford OpenAI access. We can maybe we build something here. But I also think a lot of them have a really strong appetite for engaging with SaaS tools that can do a lot of the stuff for them, and they don't want to reinvent the wheel. Leigh Marie knows this and probably can speak to it better than anyone, but the ecosystem for a lot of these tools is quite nascent. So a lot of them are looking for direction on what makes sense to try. What does a good proof of concept look like? Oh, I have this problem that I want to solve. Maybe I buy a SaaS tool, and then if that works, but there's things I want to change, then I build it in-house. And so that's where a lot of them are on the journey. Often it's this innovation officer, or even someone like you said, like a CFO, a chief customer officer, or a COO, that actually have that problem that they would like to have go away, that AI might be able to help with, rather than an AI director in a vacuum. And so a lot of the people that I know are searching for solutions to their problems that they have a hunch AI might be able to solve.
Yeah, I mean, just from my perspective on the real estate side, right? Like my day job is in commercial real estate, and we advise companies on site selection. And it seems like, as a novice kind of outsider, who I think ChatGPT was kind of a catalyst for me to kind of pause and say, oh, wait, this is accessible now, and how can you use it? If you're thinking about like site selection for a big manufacturing company, and you're like, okay, hey, I need this labor, I need these demographics, I need these like weather conditions, I need X, Y, and Z, right? Like we do that for companies, but it's kind of like, well, that could be done pretty seamlessly with like the appropriate AI kind of infrastructure or plugin, right? So just to stay on the positive, exciting stuff for a second, right? Leigh Marie, like what are you seeing in terms of like the next 12 months? Like it seems like more people are in kind of my shoe in terms of like just understanding this and thinking about it. Like it seems like there's just going to be a rocket ship of innovation and incorporation of, ChatGPT and other type of AI platforms, right? I mean, seems like it's pretty
absolutely
exciting, right? I mean, like what are the positive, like exciting things, and then I want to get to like the kind of governance.
Exactly. I knew that's where this is going.
I get to be a downer, right?
Yeah, I want to like tee it up.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth highlighting. I mean, we do have all these amazing software use cases. Whether it's Copilot for this or assistant for that, or a new sort of online companionship. But I mean, some of the things that I'd feel remiss not to highlight right before we go into like the sort of the regulation conversation is like, there are also companies that are working on using this technology to literally save people's lives. So for example, we work with this company, Viz. They use AI to basically help with detecting strokes and other types of health problems early and routing them to the right care as fast as possible. We work with other companies that help make doctors more efficient, or help make doctors more accurate, or help discover different drugs using different AI techniques. So, if we do decide to sort of limit the rate of progress of AI, we are limiting clearly things that are sort of net helping society just in terms of saving people's life. So there's that sort of angle to it. And then I also just kind of the angle of making people sort of happier and more productive generally, whether they're using a tool or they're talking with an online companion, or like an online therapist or something like that. So I do think there are, a plethora of really, really positive, no brainer use cases here, just kind of outside of the standard, where we're making this business more efficient, or we're offering this sort of new thing to grow our available market or something like that. But yeah, I think a lot of exciting companies really, really doing great work in this space.
Perfect. Sue, Markie, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think the innovation's amazing. And, even Ken, like what you were talking about in terms of the kind of digitization of kind of existing businesses and the ways that the digital models can really amplify what's being done and take it, as you're suggesting, in new directions, as opposed to just doing that, in law, where, I'm also a kind of a lecturer at the law school at Harvard. And there we saw kind of ChatGPT and others kind of come into that space, and it gives the right warning, because it's both, wow, you can do things really quickly, you can write briefs really quickly, you can do it, but there are, AI tools right now are not truth. They don't have a truth. They're a statistical what's most likely to happen next in that structure based on all the data that's out there. And so you are having, like, then what happened is, somebody submits a brief that has fake cases made up and histories that aren't there. And so we need those checks to kind of balance what's happening in the innovation, to make sure that the safety calls that you have on those products are true safety calls, and that the queuing and the way that that's done, that it's inclusive for all populations and others associated with it. And I think that's where you get the need to kind of not pause the development of these, but pause and think about how these tools are going to be governed. And governed doesn't have to be opposed to innovation. I think it kind of runs with innovation in a way that can drive innovation towards something that is really beneficial for society, as opposed to having lots and lots of just tools that enhance, whether it's efficiency or whether it enhances things. I think it can really, if done correctly, but that is a question, of course, if done correctly, I think it's something where it can really help innovation.
Yeah. Markie, as somebody who's kind of an innovator, creating on the ground lifetime, right? Like, it seems like there's this disconnect between like the big gorillas, the Microsofts, Googles, like Metas of the world, and then like this innovator class at a time where regulation and governance is accelerating as a conversation. So is there like a real worry that the kind of regulation will kind of, protect and establish a kind of, layer of support for the bigger folks, but then kind of like, hamper and create roadblocks for innovation and for new companies?
I think there is. At least in the startup ecosystem, I don't think that's like the central point of discussion. I think people are really trying to do their best to make this stuff useful. And to Sue's point, making up fake cases or things like this, there's so much harnessing that needs to be built around these things. And I think the market will demand it, and the people who are using these products and relying on them as kind of their most trusted co-pilot and companion for the kind of work that they're doing. If you make up fake cases as a lawyer, that's on you, and so people know this. They're talking to their users. These users are saying, hey, there's hallucinations in XYZ ways. And I think that rather than almost saying, oh, I hope I don't get regulated to remove these weird features, it's the market of my customers demand this because this is their jobs and these are their lives. And so a lot of that work is already happening to make a trustworthy product, not because they're getting regulated to do so, but because the people that they serve really want to feel like they can trust these systems. And, I almost think about it as this, odd sort of alien thing that just came online. And it's right in ways, sometimes it's able to do things that we can't. It can pattern match, to Sue's point, across these giant data sets and predict what would come next in ways that our brains would not be able to, but it also is less smart in ways that are obvious. It'll hallucinate and have XYZ kinds of problems. And so everyone's trying to build harnessing, I think, to give it the opportunity to be right more often, sanity checking it, making sure that you can find that case in the case of the legal example. And that's the way that you get users who are happy and can actually trust it. And so that's kind of the take. And I think Microsoft, obviously, and the bigger the company, the more there is to lose. I think what we saw with the Bard and Bing chat thing was a little bit of the canary there, where so everyone's saying, okay, I don't want to be the first one to mess this up because this thing will mess up. And so I think the bar is a lot higher, whereas a startup say, oh, oops, sorry, we hallucinated that. But as Microsoft, people would be a bit more surprised. I think that there is a little bit of an innovator's dilemma there.
Interesting. Leigh Marie, how are you thinking about kind of the headwinds of governance and regulation? I mean, the Office of Science and Technology has a request for information that just came out. They're asking for feedback on AI. The president was in California. Chuck Schumer's having a speech today, right? Like the EU is
Things
already doing
tomorrow.
things. Yeah, task force coming out tomorrow. Like this is happening at a time where I think a lot of folks in the Bay Area and maybe you kind of think like people should be allowed to run and kind of, create and innovate, right? Like without roadblocks. So like, how do you balance that? How do you think about it? Like, what's your vision of how this should roll out?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, I do think there's a balance, and I do think that I'm happy that there's like a conversation that's happening between people in the Valley and people who are making the laws and regulations. I think that sort of conversation and hearing both perspectives and sort of working together is absolutely necessary, not just across AI, but across new technology in general. And sort of like, I think we as a country are best when we have our sort of best and brightest paired with the people who are making the laws and regulations. I do worry sometimes that kind of given the ways that, people can create panic around new types of technology and overestimate the impact in the short term. I do worry that, if a regulation gets pushed out, that's, going to ultimately hamper our ability to innovate. There's just so many risks to that. I don't think it's like just a net win for us to sort of kneecap ourselves in some way or another. I mean, whether it's, as I said earlier, on kind of like the medical side of things, the healthcare side of things, or something that we haven't talked about yet on the national security side of things. Because, there's a lot of conversations happening in Europe right now, and they tend to sort of lead the way when it comes to different sort of data privacy regulations and things like that. But there are some other countries around the world that I don't think will be, artificially like prohibiting their ability to make the strongest AI or using it for national security purposes. So it is a real risk if we sort of stop going full steam ahead, that somebody else sets the tone when it comes to the world's strongest AI. And I'd rather that be us.
Interesting. Sue, how do you think about all this?
Yeah, I tend to, all of these issues are concerns, pieces of the puzzle and stuff. It's what makes this so incredibly complex to figure out how to do. I worry from the side there that there's a landscape of regulations that aren't going to be organized, that are going to make it difficult for countries to comply. I worry that they may be miss theirs. I also see, some of the leadership that's happened in Europe, in particularly with the kind of DSA recently, that and there's new AI acts and stuff coming out too, but that gives things like researcher access, so we can have transparency and understanding, and trying to think through what that means to create kind of meaningful oversight of these without controlling and constraining the innovation. Even the leaders of the kind of major AI model companies are calling for some sort of regulation. But I think, to your point, Markie, there is a huge step that needs to go forward that will be a market check associated with this, with the kind of norms that the companies establish, the ways that they have to figure out with their customers. And I do think that takes us part of the way. But, I feel like we're in the, some of the space of the kind of content moderation issues that we had with the social media platforms before, where we saw when Facebook rushed out into Myanmar, the tools and stuff weren't advanced enough in terms of the protections around it. So it ended up being used in terms of kind of fostering real human rights kind of issues against kind of minority populations. And there were these side effects that are huge related to these technologies that we need to think about. So as we build these landscapes of governance, we have to, the more it can be harmonized, the better. And I don't think that, I'm not one that thinks that government and regulation will be able to compete fast enough with the technologies, which is why I liked the approach that Prime Minister Ardern took, former Prime Minister Ardern, in her recent op-ed in the Washington Post. We're thinking about what was established in connection with the Christchurch call, which was a multi-stakeholder collaboration across kind of companies, world leaders, and others to try to figure out the tools that you need for governance and think about it, how to fill the gaps that aren't there. So I think, so stepping back in a more organized way, I think there's a company piece of this. I think there's an ecosystem piece of governance. I think there's a domestic kind of piece where we need to kind of figure out how we're centralizing all of the initiatives that are happening in the US so that there aren't standards coming from everywhere, and that consolidation in each country around the world or each region is going to want to retain control over their own regulatory space. I don't think they're going to see that. But at the same time, I do think we do need some framework for broader global governance, because there are issues that cross borders, and there are issues that we need to wrestle with at a really technologically sophisticated and fast level on an ongoing basis. So I'm hoping we can also establish that kind of multi-stakeholder initiative.
Just to double click for a second, like when you think about state government, federal government, global governments, like I feel like this is going to lead to a bit of like paralysis, right? It's like it is overwhelming. Like, what exactly do you regulate? Like, what are the actual guardrails, right? Like, I think there's a lot of talk about it, but it's like a little hard to define. Like, what would that actually look like, right? I mean, I don't know if anybody has thoughts or, you know.
Yeah, I mean, the White House laid out some of the framework for in their kind of framework for a Bill of Rights of certain things that we need to take into consideration. I think that's evolving. You know, NIST has some things that are kind of guidance with respect to that. The EU has frameworks that are being established around this, and they're all, you know, starting to come together. But I do think it is still a nascent landscape as to what that is in terms of how if you are the, you know, governor, or if you are the kind of person at a company, like, what do you do and how do you actually kind of comply with this? And I think that that's what needs to be, I think that's a whole phase that needs to be developed over the course of the next kind of couple months. It's developing rapidly as kind of that guidance to how to be involved in this, and what kind of regulation and stuff we should think about in this space.
Markie, I think you were gonna say something.
Yeah, in my conversations, you know, with folks in the financial services industry or people running healthcare companies, I have the sense that in a lot of ways, a lot of these guardrails do exist, not in the form of specific AI regulation, but in terms of what these companies can and can't do. And so, you know, we already have laws that are written down saying around some of these ethical questions that people deal with every day. And when you hire people that are going in manually approving people for loans and approving different levels of care, et cetera, we have taken steps as a country to create guardrails for human behavior already in those ways. And so it's not clear to me what are like the net new AI risks that need to be specifically, you know, when do you need to create laws about the technology versus the uses of the technology? My guess is a lot of the laws around the use of the technology already exist because people have been doing things for a very long time, and there's need to be guardrails there across these different industries. So if you're using AI to hack someone or steal money or phish, those are all things that are already illegal, and AI helping you go and do that, it's unclear to me that that means that, you know, certain versions of AI should be illegal. And plus, AI is the cat's out of the bag. AI is as easy to build as having a computer and access to the internet, and so it is everywhere. And so making clear the uses of it that would be unlawful, I think, are important, but are luckily already in place in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think it's, you know, in that, like, as you're saying, it's, you know, there's a difference in scale and speed and the kind of like strength of the tools for things like misinformation, disinformation, kind of like not being able to tell it. And we haven't figured out what the tools are to counter that, you know, for instance. And I like that you focus on the kind of the financial services sector and the healthcare sector, because I do think in both sectors that I work a ton in my life in private practice and stuff. And I do think that the regulated sectors are going to be the sectors that are heavily regulated will have a step up in terms of figuring out how to manage this, because they already have kind of risk compliance checks and controls in place for that. And so I think figuring out how these tools roll into that is something that they will have much deeper frameworks than many other countries. But I do worry there are a lot of potential uses of this, both for you know, to try to cause harm intentionally, and I think we aren't prepared to really figure out how to manage that.
Interesting. So maybe it's like a sector by sector kind of, updating of existing kind of regulatory, protections and so on. So as we kind of wrap it up, we have 5 minutes left. I'd love to kind of just go around one more time and kind of, if we're having this conversation in late June of 2024, what is this going to look like? Are we going to be regulated? Are we not? Is everyone going to just use a GPT platform? Or are people going to create their own? Like, what are your kind of crystal ball predictions? Maybe we start with you, Leigh Marie.
I guess just to make sure I'm clear, are you saying predictions over the next year, at 5, 10 years?
Well, do the year and 5 years, I guess, like between now and next year, like what do you expect? And then within the next 5 years, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in general, I think things when a big tech change happens and it gets into the sort of like public consciousness, we saw this with self-driving cars I don't know, a few years ago. It takes longer to actually sort of like productionize regulations and things like that. So I imagine a year from now, I think the conversations will sort of be going on, and I think we'll have a little bit more clarity, but I don't foresee anything concrete. And I'm not an expert here. I'm just guessing. In the next year, I would imagine that happens in like the 5 to 10 years time horizon. But yeah, I mean, I think also, the last point that I'll make is it's, imperative, not only, as Markie said, there are already laws prohibiting a lot of the really negative downsides here, but AI can also be used as a tool to prevent negative downsides here. And so one area I'm super excited about is using AI for an increase in security, or using it to help verify real content or things like that. So I do think, for every bad actor and bad use case of AI, there could be a good actor and good use case of AI. And I do think that can really help us on the sort of preventing bad outcomes front.
Interesting. Markie?
Yeah, the 1 year in the next 5 years. The way that I think about this particular moment of history is one thing I often talk with Leigh Marie about is sometimes I imagine this big dusty book of human history sitting on some spaceship very far away in space and time, and you go, you crack it open and you're looking at, call it, my lifetime, so 2000 to 2100, and I have this 100-year timeline. And something that I spent a lot of time thinking about is, what are the dots on that timeline going to be? What are these great stories and institutions that end up getting built and entering the canon? And looking at the 100 years prior, we have the computer coming online. We have kind of early, Microsoft and Apple, and the way that the computers were delivered to humanity. And when I think about the next 1 year and 5 year, I think on the more 10-year time scale, we'll start to really see what those canon entering institutions might look like. It'll take a while, but I'm optimistic in the next year or so, we'll start to see the little larval, smallest versions of them begin to come online. And I think people may start to begin to have a hunch about what could be really big here and what we might expect, where, AI engineer, we could all use one of those. That would be great, but also things that maybe nobody could have predicted, or what people think would be like crazy. And the 5-year period is where we'll start to see the early days of these dots really coming online, and signal versus a noise, I suppose, in some ways. But I think that period, which probably is really extends to the next 10 years, will be one of the greatest kind of things I could ask to see in my lifetime. And I think that it's really special to round one of those corners that is on par with rounding the corner of computers becoming like so the cost coming down such that there could be a personal computer, or the iPhone moment, or the internet moment. And looking back, right, that moment happens a couple times in your lifetime if you're lucky. If you're going to many hundreds of years before, maybe it doesn't happen at all, even once during your lifetime. So that's very aware of where we are in terms of this human timeline, and feel a great level of gratitude for being able to be a part of it as it all unfolds. So
all right, perfect. Sue?
I love your dusty book and spaceship analogy. The time capsules here, is what it is. I mean, I feel the same way. I mean, I find this such an exciting time period to live in, doing this. As a deal lawyer, I lived during, I started kind of out in the early days of the internet, and I feel like this is that same precipice where we're going. And when I think about it, we're going in that direction, and I'm hoping that we can get it right or a little bit better this time with respect to it. So I'm super excited for the innovations that are coming out in this space over the next year. I think it's been in the next 1 year. I think it's going to be kind of transformative, some of the applications that are there. At the same time, I also am thankful that what this has triggered is a global discourse around technology, around implications, around inclusion, around how this might affect other societies, marginalized communities. And so I am hopeful, fingers crossed, that we can both kind of figure out a way to get greater kind of tech proficiency in our governance, figure out ways to really create kind of meaningful oversight in this space, both on a national level and at a global level, that we can figure out something that we can work on, at least with our kind of partner countries in thinking about this, to figure out how, as a global society, we can start to think about this as a climate change moment where we're all in this together, and we really need to think about it.
This was amazing. Thank you all for making the time. Leigh Marie, Markie, Sue, great seeing you guys. Appreciate everyone tuning in today. You can always go to coffeewithken.com to catch up on past sessions and tune in for future ones. In the meantime, you can also listen to us on Spotify, iHeartRadio, or Google Play. Until next time, looking forward to talking to you guys again soon. Take care.